Hello, and welcome to the Patent Literacy Symposium. This session is syntax, somewhere between words and text. My name is Kim Jenkins, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kirsten DeRoche. We are excited to facilitate this session for everyone. Before we start, we have a few housekeeping things to review. You can access the presenter handouts for this session, the presenter bio, and the conference schedule on the Patent website, and the link is provided in the chat. Just as a reminder, this session will be recorded and is 75 minutes in length, which includes a 15-minute question and answer period. To access closed captioning, click on the icon CC Live Transcript on the Zoom control panel. If you experience technical difficulties, please go to the Technical Support Guides area above the schedule on the Symposium webpage. Because this is a webinar, microphones have been muted and your video feature has been turned off. We would love for you to tweet out or share on social media all you are learning from the Literacy Symposium. The hashtag for the symposium is #PatentLit2022. And now we would like to introduce you to our speaker, Nancy Chappell Eberhardt.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be a part of the symposium this year. I've had an opportunity to participate in the previous couple days, and it doesn't go unnoticed that it has taken multiple people, this symposium, to cover the topic of syntax. I think that speaks something about our lost colleague, William Van Cleve, that it is taking several of us to fill those shoes. But I'm eager to join the ranks of my colleagues, and I'm going to take us back to some parts about syntax that maybe haven't been covered so far. At least that's my hope. So I'd like to get started. Let me just take this off my screen. So syntax, somewhere between words and text. Let me get going. As many people have done, I'd like to orient this session within the reading rope, and indeed, syntax is in that language comprehension portion of the rope. And today I'd like to also channel a little bit of what Jan Wazowitz said the other day, which is that not only is syntax part of comprehension for reading, but it really is, and we often think about syntax as being integral to the process of writing. And these two quotes, one by Cheryl Scott and the other by Stanley Fish, capture that reciprocity. Scott, as we know, talks a lot about understanding syntax for the purpose of understanding what we're reading. And Stanley Fish is talking about the unique features of syntax in terms of helping us know how to write. Now, about 10 years ago, I ended up writing an article with the title, Syntax, Somewhere Between Words and Text. Because for me at that time, syntax was this black hole somewhere between words that kids were learning to decode and text that they were trying to read and understand. But it wasn't until Nancy Hennessy's Blueprint for Reading Comprehension came out that I saw a graphic that actually illustrated this very point of going from words to text. And what we're going to do today, for the most part, is focus on those three boxes between words and text, because that's what syntax is all about. But I would like to start today by telling you my agenda, and then we'll go through the details. First of all, I'd like to explore this process of getting meaning building from words to text. Then I'd like to identify ways that syntax impacts language comprehension, because what we are trying to do is not do this as a rote task, but as a meaning-based task. I'd also like to make a case for beginning syntax instruction with beginning readers. Many of the folks who've been talking about syntax this week have talked about complex text and using syntax to unpack that. I'd like to argue for the case of we need to start talking about some of these elements from the very beginning. And then I'd like to also, most importantly, leave you today with some instructional activities that I hope you'll be able to use tomorrow. Unlike many aspects of literacy that have programs, this area of syntax is less program driven, and therefore having activities, things you can do with any text you're using, becomes really important. So with that, I would like to start, despite the fact that I'm talking about those middle boxes, with a little review of what's going on at the word level, because each word in our language fits into those grammatical elements, and the questions that help us understand what each word is doing become the same questions to a large extent that drive syntax. So I'd like to do what I call a hopefully brief but spectacular review of the building blocks of our language. And it's really remarkable, actually, I use the word elegant, that we have 8 elements, grammatical elements, that make up all of our language, all of our words. And from that, we get from 8 to infinity with these structures. They are the building blocks that create all of our sentences. And one of the things we're going to look at today is how syntax intersects with other parts of that reading rope, like vocabulary, word meaning, sentence structure. And then, of course, the better we get at using syntax, the more it will improve fluency. What I'm really going to zero in on for the next few minutes, though, is that each of these elements has a specific meaning-based function, and those functions are driven by the question that those words answer. And as I said, together, these provide the basis for all of our syntax of English. So with that, let's take a look at the first little cluster of these grammatical elements, the noun, the pronoun, and the adjectives. And these are the words that together name our world. They're the words that tell us the objects, the ideas, and so on. The second cluster are the actions of our language. They are the jump, the shout, the slither, all those wonderful words that bring life to our language. These little guys, prepositions and conjunctions, are the connectors. They're the unsung heroes of our language, because without them, there'd be a lot of dangling information in what we say. And we'll look at those in a few moments. And then last but not least, we have interjections. Think of that as the spice of our language. So let's quickly go through those questions, though, that help us know which grammatical element we're talking about. And so for nouns, that question is, who or what did it? And I'm going to be using some illustrations from a delightful children's book, City Dog, Country Frog. I promise you, I do not have royalties from this company or from the author for using these pictures, but I just think they're wonderful. I also will make a comment that my dear colleague and friend Margie Gillis and I developed these as part of a symposium we did, or a webinar we did together. And so you may have seen some of these with her session on Tuesday. But anyway, in this, the namer is the dog, because it's naming that object. And then the farmhouse is another namer. These come in varieties, nouns do. They are people, they can be things, dog, boat, house. They can be places, be it specific, like a state, or a more global place like the woods. And they can also label our ideas, love, justice. But often we want to tell more about those namers or those nouns, and we have specific questions that let us do that. For the nouns, we have 3 questions: how many, what kind, and which one. So, for example, when we talk about how many, we could mean one or a group. For what kind, we are getting into what are those attribute words, and like color and size or fluffy. The one that's really challenging that we don't often think of as an adjective is the which one. And that's because often which one is a prepositional phrase that follows the noun. Like to distinguish between these dogs, it's the one on the leash versus the one next to the tree. And you wouldn't know which one I'm talking about unless I use some descriptor. Now, sometimes we don't want to keep saying the noun over and over, and that's where we have these wonderful words called pronouns that refer back to our nouns. And remember these, because these are part of the group of words that we call cohesive ties. And we're going to talk about that in a few moments. And again, we see that we can refer back to the dog as he. We can refer back to the farmhouse as it. Then there's this other huge group of words we have, the actions in our language called verbs, and they are the ones that tell us actions, or at least most of them do. So the question we ask to identify verbs or actions is did what? And so in this picture, did the frog do? It jumped. But there is another group of words, verbs rather, that are linkers. They connect, and these are the verbs like is to the to be words. And think of those as kind of an equal sign. So the city dog is what? Friend, and it's those two words are equal, and that's why we call it a linking verb. Now, again, as with nouns, we often want to tell more about the action, and we have very specific questions that we ask about that. Where, when, how, and why. And one of the things I'd like to point out here is sometimes those are single words like here or sadly. Sometimes, again, they are phrases. We often have people tell students, adverbs have ly, but if we look at this small sample, we see that really that's not the case for most of these, that we have other words and other ways of telling more about the action. So I'd like to ask you to put in the chat, if you would, what might you answer to this picture, where, when, why, or how, to give you a chance to experience adding that information about this picture. And I'm going to see if I can see this in my chat. I'm not sure if I can. No, I'm not seeing. Oh, yes, there we go. Wonderful. So we have some that are saying time, in the pond is where, in the morning. Wonderful. And when we think about using this activity, now I need to get rid of this. Oh, how do I get rid of my chat? There. We can do this orally with children using pictures in any picture book. And I think that's one of the takeaways, is that any book really gives you an opportunity to practice some of these syntactic ideas. So moving on, thank you for that. Here's our next group of words, and those are prepositions, and they're just so important. They signal the relationship between words. And we probably, at least in my generation, we learned that a preposition introduces a prepositional phrase. But so what? Well, so what is that prepositions act like either adjectives or adverbs when they are in this structure, beginning with a preposition and ending with a noun. So they answer the same questions as the adjectives did, which is what kind and which one. And what I want to point out here, mentioned it with the dogs earlier on, is that these prepositional phrases often come right after the noun that they are describing. So the frog with big eyes is telling us it's not the frog with green spots, it's that one with the big eyes. The same thing, the frog on the rock is not the frog that's in the water, it's the one that's on the rock. Now, some of you may be saying, but on the rock is telling me where. Yes, it could be, but only if it was describing the action, not the noun. So that probably makes you think, well, there must be some prepositional phrases that go with with the actions, and indeed they are the adverbial questions, where, when, and how. And here we see again that they often will follow the word that they are describing, such as where did the dog run across the wide open field. But what's unique about and different from the adjectival questions is that adverbs can move around, and we can take the phrase during the summer and we can put that before the action. We could also say the city dog taught country frog new games during the summer, and that would be equally intelligible or correct. But this is a big difference with the adverbial prepositional phrases. Then there are our conjunctions, and again, another unsung hero of our language. They come in two big categories: coordinating conjunctions and subordinating conjunctions. And probably the simplest way to remember this is that the coordinating are combining or joining equal parts, and we use those conjunctions like and, or, and but, whereas subordinating conjunctions introduce phrases or clauses that are unequal. They're the parts that can't stand on their own. They're what we call a dependent clause or phrase. So these also are hugely important because they show the connections, again, those connective ties that we'll look at again in a moment between our language. And then last but not least, our language wouldn't be the same without interjections, where we can add some spice to our language. I think of these as kind of the emojis of our language, because they're just little pops of our expressions about our language. So with that brief review under our belts, those questions, the who did it, what did it, when, where, how, and so on, become really important as we move into what we're talking about with syntax. So we have these middle three parts of Nancy Hennessy's graphic: the phrase, the clause, and the sentence. And I think that what she did here was so important, because often we think of syntax as only being about what goes on or what we need to know to write sentences or understand sentences. But in fact, a lot happens at the very beginning of this with phrases and understanding clauses. Deborah Reed did a wonderful, albeit short, portion of a webinar as part of the 20th anniversary of the reading rope for Patton a year or so ago, where she labeled this group of meaning building components as the microstructure of our language. And what she was contrasting, that I think is important for us to keep in mind, is that we often jump from words to macrostructure, the narratives, the expository structures. But in fact, this microstructure level is really important for us to spend time addressing. Nobody captured this better, I think, than this quote many of you I'm sure have seen from Cheryl Scott, that if a reader cannot derive meaning from individual sentences that make up text, that is going to be a major obstacle to text level comprehension. So if there was no other reason for us to spend time on syntax and sentence level work, it's this. I also think we should keep in mind that the more opportunities children have to hear, discuss syntax, sentence level work, the better their comprehension will ultimately be. Another thing that I want to bring up, and this came up in a conversation with Stephanie Stoller of the Reading Science Academy, where we were talking about syntax, and she said, Nancy, you know, one of the best predictors of subsequent reading performance is the tell about task from the PELI, the preschool early literacy indicators. And I thought, wow, that's huge. And I love the tell about, because that is really what I was just illustrating going through all those parts of speech. When children can take a word and tell more about it, elaborate about it, they are showing us that their language skills are coming along. And we've spent a lot of time through the science of reading on the code emphasis. And I love the fact that this really has us taking a look and paying attention to the importance early on of working on that language side, and syntax is a player in that. So I said earlier, we often jump over to sentences, but the awareness of phrases and what can happen even at that level is really important. So let's take a look for a moment at what's going on at the phrase level. We can interpret word meaning there. We can use phrases to help us improve fluency. And if we can have students sort phrases, just like we sort words, we also are reinforcing their awareness of some of those questions about their function. And as Carlisle and Rice say, paying attention to these units of phrases will help improve comprehension and for memory for what they're reading. So let's take a look at a couple of words here, and perhaps you could put this in the chat. Question: are these words I'm showing you a noun or a verb? So what do you think? Oh, you guys are really, really clever. Yes, many of you are saying both, and it depends on how they're used. And in fact, that is exactly the point. Let me just get out of this again. How did I do that the last time? Oh, no, just a minute. No. How did I get rid of this? Help. I can't see my screen. At any rate,
Nancy, if you click across the Zoom bottom where it has chat on there, you can just click the chat and it should disappear again.
Oh, there we go. Okay, it's up at the top for me, so that's why it was covering things. Thank you. So as you all caught on very quickly, it depends, and we cannot identify word meaning without context. This is why learning the meanings of words really has to be driven by that context. And so many of the words of our language have multiple meanings. So for example, with the word season, it could be the time or a period of the year, or it's a flavor we add to food. We don't know which of those meanings we mean until we get them into a sentence. So syntactic awareness, which is that awareness of this manipulation and the meaning that changes or is impacted by the way words are used, is what we are trying to develop. And again, we can do this really early on with kids playing with the words. So again, even at the phrase level, take two words. We can arrange these as green grass or grass green. Does that make a difference? Well, indeed it does, because green grass refers to that plant material that we have in our lawns. Hopefully it's green. Or it can be a color, a shade of green that is, for example, the color of these balloons. And it's that shifting, realizing that the word can change its function from noun to an adjective, to a descriptor, that we want children to become aware of early on. And this example, well, first of all, this quote from Steven Pinker is really important for us to remember. In these last examples are really illustrating that beyond knowing what the word is, like what is grass, is when we arrange these words that becomes important for the meaning we're trying to convey. And, in the two sentences, Ben painted the white fence, or Ben painted the fence white, the movement of that word white from before and to after the word fence completely changes the potential meaning. So how can we use this as teachers to help us with students and their comprehension and their reading? Well, first of all, we can talk about the components that we're working on, these meaning clusters of words, be it the subject, prepositional phrases, and ultimately clauses. And we can apply that to a text. So I've taken, no surprise, a little sentence from City Dog, Country Frog. And I'd like for you to think for a moment how you might group the words, instead of reading word by word, into clusters. Just take a moment to sort of mentally think, where would these boundaries around groups of words occur, and be thinking why based on those functional questions. So you might be thinking, well, City Dog tells us who or what. And then the next words, didn't stop, tells us did what. And then the next group of words on that first day tells us when. And as we continue, as you start to move away from word by word reading and work in these meaningful groups, and I don't want you to get hung up on it being precise, because we did put he and ran together there, but that's because that was a really simple sentence component within that longer sentence, that we begin to read in a more fluent way. So when a child starts to use text reading prosody by using correct word boundaries, use of pauses, and intonation, this is what begins to influence their comprehension of the text. And so we have to teach this, though, is the point. We want students to read with prosody, but we can help facilitate that by placing some emphasis on instruction using those phrases. We also can practice this starting really early on. I'm in the process with my colleague and friend Cheryl Ferlito of bringing back to life something we did 20 years ago, sortagories. And what we're doing is building phrases using the decodable, and it can be really simple decodable words. But what we've added, so what we've done is we've taken the words and we build the phrase. But the most important part of this activity is now asking the students the question, the bat, in the sentence, the bat flew out of the cave. Is it who did it, or what did it do? Because it's understanding that that group of words now has meaning as a unit. And we can also use this, take any text, sentence rather, from text, and we can use it as a sorting activity. So if you looked at this sentence, you could think, oh, are there any words or phrases that answer these questions? And I've highlighted them here so that we can see them. And we can see in the spring, together, in the pond are examples of phrases and individual words that we could then have children sort according to what they're answering, the when, the how, and the where. So once we are getting better at phrases, or as along with that, we now have to do what Nancy Hennessy points out, is that we have to figure out how these words logically relate to each other to construct meaning. And that's now related through some very limited number of sentence types. I don't know if this is even more amazing than that there are only 8 grammatical elements, but that we only have a certain number of sentence structures. But there are 2 basic ones that we think about, and that is subject and predicate, or subject, predicate, and object. And understanding that who did what, which are those same questions we were talking about with individual words, become helpful when we are now trying to understand what makes a sentence, and that we have to have these two parts. And what I'm illustrating here is that if we first start with those functional questions, then labeling them with subject and predicate has more meaning for children. Starting out calling something a subject and a predicate is pretty abstract when we haven't first locked in that basic meaning. And then we obviously have to ask the question, we don't only have the subject and predicate, we also can add to whom or to what. And when we do that, we now have the object of the sentence. So this is where we go to that second simple sentence structure, which is the subject, predicate, and object. But then Steven Pinker also told us just a moment ago that we can change the meaning by rearranging. And so the importance of something as simple as the city dog taught the country frog versus the country frog taught the city dog is who is doing the action and who is receiving that action. And it does make a difference what the order is. So when children read, the goal is for them to use that understanding to facilitate their comprehension. So we're not going to go spend time on in depth on the sentence, different types of sentences. In fact, I'd encourage you to look at or watch Margie's session from earlier in the symposium. She gets into more about complex sentences. So did Carol Tolman yesterday. So they spent more time on that, but I don't want to just skip over this. So I'd like to just talk quickly through the four types of sentences. We've talked about simple, which is that subject action, subject verb structure. And we don't want to confuse simple sentences with short because the second sentence, the enormous waves crashed against the rocky shore, is every bit as simple a sentence in terms of its structure. Compound sentences are those sentences that are joined by those conjunctions. Notice we have our connector and we can combine, in this case, we're combining two simple sentences. We can compound other parts within a sentence. We can have a compound subject, the waves and wind grew. We could also compound the actions, the people ran and shouted. But the point is, compounding a sentence often will be perceived or be identified rather by using a conjunction. Then we have our complex sentences where we use those subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns to have one part of the sentence be subordinate or less and not independent. So waves crashed when the tsunami hit the coastline. When the tsunami hit the coastline is not an independent clause. It is dependent on the previous independent clause. And in this case, when the tsunami hit the coastline is telling us about the crash. So I bet you're already thinking, that's an adverbial clause, right? The second example, the waves, which were as tall as houses, damaged the village, is another example of a dependent clause introduced by the word which. And in this case, it is describing the waves. So now we know that this must be acting like an adjective. And that is the kind of progression we want children to go through, which is from understanding the meaning and what it's telling us to being able to label it as grammatically correctly. And then the last example is compound complex. And in this case, it is exactly what you would expect is we have the compound part is the dependent clause. And then we have our compound part, which is the part joined by the coordinating conjunction and. So once we get our students knowing how to recognize these things, Charlie Haynes in his book, Speaking to writing. And it's not just Charlie Haynes, it's with his colleague Jennings. They talk about giving students sentence formulas or sentence frames. And again, my colleague and I are using this idea in sortagories so that we can teach kids to say, oh, if I'm going to build a sentence with this formula, I'm going to look for a what did it. And what kind of word would that have to be from among these options? You can probably select a few as you're looking at this. Did what? And then we have to identify an action. And in fact, we can come up with the chickens scratch in the dust. Now, some of you may have thought plant what could have been a what did it, but that won't make sense when we add it, have only the action scratch. And then the second example shows we can carry this sentence formula to a much larger and more complicated extent and have kids really begin to look at the role that words are playing. And of course, we always want to end, as this does, by showing the student the sentence with the correct capitalization and punctuation. So let's now move to a super important part of syntax, which is its role in providing text cohesion. And I like to think of this as where grammar and comprehension meet. It's where there are words that help us do what cohesion is all about, which is connecting meaning across sentences. You know, we're always thrilled when children can go from reading individual words to reading sentences, but books and articles aren't made up of individual sentences. So we have to help students understand the connections between them. So let's review what are some of those grammatical parts that now become also referred to as cohesive ties. And one of them is certainly pronouns, where we have feathers is replaced in the next sentence by the word they, explicitly pointing out that relationship between the first sentence and the role of they in the second sentence is part of what the explicit instruction we would need to be doing. Another part of the cohesive ties, another type, I should say, are synonym substitutions. So part of our use of these cohesive ties is to vary the way we refer to the same thing. And that gets us into using synonyms. So in this case, berries is replaced in the second, or substituted in the second sentence by the ripe fruit. It means the same thing. We could have flipped those and said, get the ripe fruit, and then berries are a prize goal. And the meaning would be the same because they're substituting for each other. And then we also want to keep in mind that we can have larger groups of words, like which brought a great sense of relief, to replace or substitute for a word like comfort. Again, I refer to this from Charlie Haynes because it's just such a wonderful way to help students understand this cohesive replacement idea, and then how we can go from that original noun feathers to a synonym, and then go on to the pronoun they, and then back to another synonym. Now, they use this for writing purposes, but as you're going to see in a moment, I think it has every bit as much applicability for reading comprehension. So why is text cohesion important, and why should we be really paying attention to these little connecting words like pronouns and conjunctions and prepositions? Because it helps the reader to integrate meaning across sentences. And it's their ability to interpret and use these connectives that is crucial to text cohesion. Danielle McNamara and her colleagues make this point that increasing text cohesion improves comprehension, understanding, and memory for text. And in fact, I mentioned here that they have created a text analyzer tool called Cometrics. And this whole topic of cohesion was so important to them that they broke out the type of cohesion analyzed in text to that's called referential cohesion, which are those things that are replaced by the pronouns and substitute namers, versus deep cohesion, which gets at the use of those coordinating and more subordinating conjunctions, where we're showing a deeper and different kind of relationship across the text. Of course, referential is a little bit easier because we can spot those words and understand them, but deep cohesion and understanding those words and how they signal the relationship across text is very important to teach explicitly. So that gets us through from words. Now we're over to text. And what is the connection between these four boxes and text? So, excuse me. So how do these relate? Well, first of all, we largely lump or group our text into informational and narrative. And the reality is that those types of grammatical elements and structures that we use, syntactical structures, are different in informational text, where there's a preponderance of nouns. Often they're new meaning words that we have to teach. That's where vocabulary intersects with this whole subject. We use adjectives to tell us more about the content of those nouns. We get into long and convoluted sentences with many more complex sentence structures. And we also will find the use of passives. That overall is more difficult than narrative, which tends to use more familiar words. This is what our children are starting to use early on. Lots more action words in narratives. That leads us to using more adverbs. And then, of course, we do a lot with pronouns because we don't keep saying the same name of people over and over. So, but the difference between these structures is very important. And one of the things that McNamara and her colleagues try to help analyze through that tool. So one of the examples that I'd like to show here is that we can do this kind of analysis. I'd argue we should do this kind of analysis with just pairs of sentences where we can say, okay, who or what is the first sentence about? And hopefully you're thinking starfish. And then as we get to the second sentence, they are animals that live in the sea. What is the word they referring to? And hopefully we can have students learn that kind of relationship. But one of the programs that I found enormously helpful in helping students learn this is from the Language Circle program Report Form, where Tori Green did a masterful job teaching children how to track through the text, looking for these cohesive ties by looking for pronouns that are replacing the noun, looking for substitute namers, because when we ask children at the end of reading something, what is it about? What we want them to be able at a minimal level is to identify the who or what the whole passage is about. So think for a moment, look through this, think about that cohesion circle that Charlie Haynes provided for us, and sort of say, okay, can I identify, trace through here those substitute namers and or other cohesive ties? And hopefully, if you're doing this, you'll be looking for, we see starfish a lot. We use that a lot, perhaps too much. We also use the replacement, this animal. And then we also have references to the pronoun, to the starfish using pronouns. We could take this article after we do this and say, could we find other ways to not repeat starfish so often? But at the end of the day, we want students to be able to articulate and to notice that this is how text hangs together, how we stick on a topic. And if they write something, we can ask them to do the same thing to analyze their own work. I would also direct you in the handout on the last page or 2 pages, 2 slides rather, an article within the Perspectives issue on syntax. There's an article by Mary Sheppelgrill who talked about this process as looking for referential chains, that we're looking for the references across text. And she did a beautiful job of explaining how to do this and why this is hard for some within some text to do. So I would now like to bring this up to application, if you will, with a text. This particular text is from readworks.org. For those of you who know this, it's a fabulous free resource for both informational and an increasing body of fictional material. But what I'd like to illustrate here, and we are actually going to see it put into action with a video, is how we can use these various function-based questions to help students as they're reading text. So in this article about hurricanes, what we want to do is to purposefully ask students the question, who did it? And those would, of course, be our namers, our nouns, and did what? And those would be the actions, or what we call verbs. And through that process, what we as teachers are doing is directing students to pay attention to the words that are integral to understanding the topic. Now, in this particular case, ReadWorks is helping us by giving us words in blue, but some text you would have to identify that for yourselves, or the students would. And we have some words that would fit into both of those categories. So I'd like to show you how this looks with children and how we can use this informational text to orally express sentences. Thanks to my good friends and colleagues at Literacy How, and in particular, Elke Blanchard. She did this video.
Good to see you again.
To show
Today
this.
We're going to read an article, and it's about a type of weather. Okay, so let me pass that article out to each of you. What type of weather is it that we're doing?
Hurricane.
A hurricane, right. We're going to be writing sentences. And so if we're talking about who do's, right, let's first start talking about the who, or the noun. What are we talking about in this story, in this article? Hurricanes, right? We're talking about hurricanes. Let's take a look at some of the actions that hurricanes do. What's the who do? What are they doing? What's the verb? So who can take a look and start with that first sentence, or can go on and find an action word for me?
Move. One is move.
That one is move. All right, so everybody, can you circle move? And I'm going to put move up here as well. We have our who, we have our do. Does anybody see something else that they do before that sentence that said that they move?
The form over the ocean.
Yeah, and so the word is form. Circle the word form. What does that mean, to form? How would you explain that word to like a kindergartner or something? Yeah.
Form means how a little caterpillar goes from a caterpillar to a butterfly.
It
That's
forms
like
into, so it kind of
evolves.
Whoa, that's a really good. It evolves. It's how it starts. I was thinking of the word starts. I like evolves. And what was the word that you said?
Caterpillar evolve.
You're using evolve already. Nice. Okay. So we have that they move, that they form. All right. And is there a third one that you can see that it says that what a hurricane does?
It spins.
It spins. Yeah. Okay. So we have a who and we have our do's. Give me a sentence. Go ahead.
Hurricanes spin around.
Hurricanes spin around. Yeah. What is the part that spins?
It's not the eye.
It's not the eye, right? The eye doesn't spin. So what's that part that's spinning around it?
It's
What is that
kind of
stuff?
So like, do you know like a wheel? Like it has a hole in the middle and you could spin it.
And it goes, so it
And it
goes,
goes around and keeps on
and what does it go
spinning.
around?
The eye.
It goes around the eye. Oh, so can we add that where for where does it spin? So can somebody give me that same sentence that you said, but now add the where of what you just said around the eye? Want to do it?
The hurricane spins around the eye.
The hurricane spins around the eye. All right, good sentence.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the wind and rain moves around the eye.
Okay, they move around the eye. And what does it say? What does the author tell us about the hurricane? Where does it move? Because yes, the wind and the rain move around the eye, or they spin around the eye. And what is right in here? Find the sentence where the author tells us where it moves. It meaning the hurricane. Toward the land. Yes, it moves towards the land. So can you give me that as a sentence?
Hurricanes
Move near the land, yes. All right, and how about, can someone talk to me about that word form? And give me a sentence about form. So, but it is exactly what you're saying. It's that water of the ocean that helps them to form, helps them to evolve or to create, right? So if we had 3 sentences, all our sentences began with hurricanes. Hurricanes move over the land. Hurricanes form over the ocean. Hurricanes spin around the eye. I don't want to keep saying hurricanes, hurricanes, hurricanes. What else can we call them?
The storm.
The storm.
A couple of things I'd just like to point out in that video was how deliberate Elke was in having the students do a couple of things. One, refer to the text for the information. Perhaps they knew it already, but she was driving them back to pay attention to the actual words that were being used. She was also recording, which you probably could see on a whiteboard, the words that they were using and keeping it organized for them to then be able to use it as a reference later on. So that was the first part of the video. And then what she was trying to do, and I think you saw part of that in this part of the video, was that we added, after she had those who's and do's, or the what and do, she had the children add this additional where information. I just would comment, you could also have when information if that was what you were focusing on, or you could do how. The point of it is this can be very focused and very explicit, but very much an oral language activity. But we ultimately want to get to the students writing. So we have another portion of this same activity that she did with the kids actually going from an oral paragraph to a written. And so let's watch that.
So I'm going to be the topic sentence. All right. You guys are going to say your sentences aloud. We're going to create that paragraph, oral language paragraph. Are you ready? And remember, you're going to do the who, the do, the where. All right. Our oral language paragraph. Hurricanes have many interesting features.
Hurricanes move toward land. Hurricanes form over the ocean.
Yeah.
Rain and wind spins around the eye. A storm can form into a hurricane.
That's some pretty interesting stuff. Do you want to learn more? Done. All right, and so let's talk about this one for a second. Rain and wind, and I wrote spins at first, but because we're talking about two things, we're going to say,
Rain
Right.
and wind spin around the
all right, and you said hurricanes, but I don't want you to use hurricanes when you write your sentence. I want you to use the word storms. How do we say that and without just saying storm forms? What are we gonna use right before it? The storm. Yeah, the storm. We could say this storm. We could say these storms, right? So you could say the, this, or these to do it. You got it? All right, are you guys ready? All right, so can you guys write your sentences? Think about, sentence structure, your capitals, your periods, your spacing, okay? Hurricanes have many interesting features.
Storms can form into hurricanes. The storm forms around the ocean. Rain and wind spin around the eye. Hurricanes move toward land.
These are just a few facts about hurricanes. Would you like to learn more?
All right. And then, of course, she illustrated getting to this. So what we watched with that video was this process of going from those individual functions of words to putting it together and using the text to get there. So as I said earlier, any text can become a grammar text. So a few takeaways as we come upon the hour here. First of all, I've illustrated several times, identify function first, label later. Use explicit instructional practices, meaning let's say we're going to add where and then teach doing that. Start early to develop syntactic awareness. Most of the things that you've seen today could start in the kindergarten primary grades as students are beginning to learn to read, and infuse syntax throughout the day. So let's just quickly look at those again. Identify function first. In these three sentences, could you identify what yesterday at dusk and as the sunlight faded mean? They all are telling us answering when. Once we know that, we know if it's answering when, it's an adverb, an adverbial phrase, or an adverbial clause. So we're going from function to label. Judith Hochman talks to us a lot about explicitly teaching complex sentence structure, and that centers around teaching kids what happens to our sentence when we use conjunctions like because, but, and so. And we can do this by taking the same, and she does this by using the same sentence stem. The two chemicals fail to react because, but, and so. And what she illustrates is how you have to know the meaning of what, or you have to have comprehended what you read to be able to make those shifts in meaning with because, but, and so. I also am making a pitch for using this topic of syntax with decodable text, even in this little 3-sentence excerpt from a whole phonics story. We can point out pronouns like he, and who is he referring to? Well, it refers to Gus. Why not point these things out? And then we can also point out, and they're very small decodable words, but, and then so, we can show students what happens to meaning by using those. And then Margie Gillis and I have been working on this concept of, if we can take these ideas that we're working on for literacy and expand them through other subject areas, like in social studies, we could talk about the who's and the do's in our community, if we're doing a unit on the community, or if we're doing a unit on the Revolutionary War, who are the people and what did they do? Same thing with unpacking or deconstructing math word problems. We can do that as well. And in science, I think you can extrapolate. So with that, you could be thinking about the syntax matters. William always said that to us. but because, why is it important? Syntax matters, and syntax matters so. So be thinking how you might answer those and your reflections on what might you do based on what we did this morning and what we talked about this morning, and how that might influence your practice. But I know we're up to the point where I think I should let us answer some questions if there